Let's talk about bones in this video. Bones are a type of connective tissue, so just like the connective tissues proper that we looked at earlier this semester, bone is made up of mostly extracellular matrix, so lots of proteins like collagen, but then we also have this other inorganic component as well. There are specialized cells in it that are named with the blast, clast, and site uh, suffixes, and we're going to see how these are built over the next couple of videos. Uh, all 206 bones of the body can be classified according to shape. We have the long bones, which are longer than they are wide. We have short bones, which are, roughly as wide as they are tall. We have flat bones, so nice and flat, compact bone with a little bit of spongy bone squished in the middle. So this would be like your sternum and like the bones of your skull. Um, our vertebrae are irregular bones, so they don't follow any particular pattern, any particular shape. They've got lots of stuff sticking out all over the place. And so they're very irregular. And finally, we have a sesamoid bone, really only one example in the body, and this is a bone that forms within a tendon. And so our patella forms within the quadriceps tendon and patellar ligament. Uh, we're going to focus on long bones and flat bones here because they're good representatives. But really, regardless of shape, bones in general have some of the same structural similarities. First of all, they are covered by a periosteum. So perimeter going around the outside, and ost is a root that means bone. And so in both of these images, a flat bone and a long bone, we can see that this little membrane, the periosteum, has been kind of peeled back so that we can see, like this is the bony tissue on the inside, and this is this membrane called the periosteum. Same thing on a flat bone of our skull. This periosteum here has been peeled back so that we can see this is the bone, but this is the membrane. Now, the periosteum is fused to the bone itself by what are called perforating fibers. And so these are super strong proteins that literally fuse into the bone. So they keep the periosteum actually on the bone. All bones, regardless of shape, are surrounded by a shell of compact bone. So here we can see the more solid structure is compact bone, and inside it's spongy bone. Now, just like pretty much everything else in anatomy, we have multiple names for spongy bone. We can call it trabecular bone, named after these little riblets of bone called trabeculae. We can also call it a cancellous bone. I'll refer to it as spongy bone, though, because that's the easiest. So let's talk a little bit more about the periosteum, like what exactly is it? Again, it covers the external surfaces of the bone, pretty much everything except for where the bones form a joint. On those surfaces, we need a little bit more kind of like slippery, like lubricated tissue to protect the ends of our bones. And so we have what's called hyaline cartilage. You'll learn about that soon. But every part of the bone, except for where it forms a joint, is covered with the periosteum. The periosteum has two different layers, and in this diagram down here, we can actually see one layer on the outside and then a cellular layer on the inside. This outer fibrous layer serves as an anchoring point for our tendons and our muscles. So here we can see a muscle. The epimysium here extends to a tendon here. And the tendon fuses to the periosteum in order to secure that muscle to the bone. So the origin and the insertion of a muscle are actually attached to those different bones via the periosteum. So it's an anchoring point on the outside. The perforating fibers extend all the way from this outer fibrous layer, the really strong, tough, protective part, all the way down into the outer layers of the bone. And so here on the very outside, we can see the the fibrous layer of the periosteum, and this is a perforating fiber deep inside the bone. The deeper layer, so the one that's actually touching the bone itself, it's actually made of cells. These cells are called osteogenic cells, meaning osteo, this is bone-genic, so they generate bone cells. These are stem cells. And as a stem cell, they don't have a particular fate until they are stimulated to grow up and become something. That is, depending on the needs of the body, the needs of the bone at the time, these osteogenic stem cells can be triggered to become a bone building cell, a bone breaking down cell. They can be triggered to become cartilage cells. So anything bone and bone adjacent, these stem cells can grow up to become. Okay, and so this is actually really important in healing our bones. It's really important in making our bones bigger and stronger. It's really important in balancing the calcium within our body. So lots and lots of functions are facilitated by the stem cells in our periosteum. Um, Also, within the periosteum are blood vessels. Remember that connective tissue, as opposed to epithelial tissue, is very vascular. So we have lots of blood vessels. We have lots of active cells that need to eat. And so there are lots of blood vessels within the periosteum, and it's actually a route um, into the bone to supply the bone with even more blood. Okay. Again, connective tissue is um, innervated, so we can sense what's going on in most of our connective tissues, and so there are lots of nerve fibers in the periosteum as well. Let's look at the structure of an entire bone. So in this case, a long bone. We have um, a lot of long bones within our body. So let's look at this characteristic set of structures of a long bone. This in particular is a femur, so your thigh bone. Long bones, of course, are longer than they are wide. They have a skinny region in the middle called a diaphysis, and each end has what's called an epiphysis. So physis, a growth, and epi means on top of, so on top of the growth. So here, this fatter region and this fatter region are called the epiphyses. And so these are a little bit wider than the rest of the bone. Essentially, this is important in forming a joint with other bones. It distributes weight a little bit more, so there's not so much pressure on that articular cartilage, right? So the protection of the long bone. Also, it serves as a lot of anchoring points. For example, on the femur here, we see this structure off to the side. We'll learn about that in the next unit. But this is essentially an anchor to pull on the bone and move our thigh in all different directions. Within the diaphysis, we have a medullary cavity or a medullary cavity. We can see when we take a cross section through the bone that there is an open space inside the diaphysis. In adults, this marrow cavity, this medullary cavity, is filled with yellow bone marrow. And yellow bone marrow is important because it's a source of energy. So the yellow is actually fat. And if you've ever gotten soup bones from the grocery store to cook up for soup or for a treat for your dog or something, those soup bones are actually like a cross section through a femur of a cow or a pig, and inside it's got that really gooey stuff that your dog loves, and it makes the soup super tasty. That's fat. Okay, this isn't fat that you go to the gym and try to lose that weight. This is really important for nourishing, for supplying energy to your bones. Okay, so that's yellow marrow. The medullary cavity is lined with a membrane called the endosteum. So you can see here the entire cavity lined with another membrane. This is similar in function to the periosteum in that it has stem cells. So again, really important in maintaining homeostasis of calcium, maintaining strength of the bone, healing the bone if you break it or damage it otherwise. So endosteum, very similar to the periosteum, but it doesn't have such rigid extracellular matrix that fibrous connective tissue on the outside. Okay, the epiphyses, these again form joints with other bones. Again, the widened areas increase the surface area, reducing the force and the friction on the joint itself, on that cartilage. Again, these are always covered in cartilage. In all of the images we're going to look at, cartilage is represented as blue. So here we have a special type of tissue, which is called hyaline cartilage, and you'll learn more about this. But the tissue type is hyaline cartilage. And the structure, right, like where is the structure? The structure is called articular cartilage, right? So those two get confused a lot. So hyaline is the tissue, articular is the structure. In the epiphyses, there's a lot of spongy bone, and spongy bone, as we're going to learn, has a lot of spaces in between those little riblets, which are called trabeculae. And so those spaces are really important because they house, they protect our red bone marrow. And so this is where all of our um, blood cells are made, our red blood cells, our white blood cells, and our platelets. They're all made right here in this nice protected area of the epiphyses. And really within any spongy bone, so not just within the epiphyses of long bones. In the long bone, we have a couple different structures in an adult bone that are kind of left over, they're kind of scar remnant of our bone development as we grew up. First of all, we have essentially what used to be our growth plates. These are called epiphyseal lines, and we can see here it's a little bit of compact bone passing through the spongy bone. We always have at least one on the proximal epiphysis and the distal epiphysis, right? Proximal closer to the body, distal farther from the body. And again, they are a remnant of our growth plates. Essentially, our growth plates fuse, and you'll learn more about that in this lesson. But our both growth plates fuse or close and are replaced with this compact bone. And so that compact bone never really goes away. It stays for the rest of our lives. The second remnant of bone development, this actually started even before we had growth plates. Very early on, again, you're going to learn about this soon, our bones are not bone yet, they're actually cartilage. And so it's like this little cartilaginous model of kind of sort of what your bone is going to look like. And one of the first steps to trigger the formation of bone is the entrance of a blood vessel into the diaphysis of the bone. And so that entrance of a blood vessel into the diaphysis essentially stays for the rest of your life. And so this hole through which the main blood vessel going to your bone passes is called a nutrient foramen. Remember, a foramen is a hole, and this is for passing of nutrients into the diaphysis. And so this nutrient foramen supplies about 2/3 of the blood to the bone, and the periosteum supplies the other third. If we zoom in and look at bone tissue, we see that the outer shell is compact bone. Compact bone is, of course, structured very differently than spongy bone, which is all the way on the inside. And so, as always, I want you to think about how the structure matches the function. Compact bone, it's the shell on the outside. It's going to be subjected to a ton of stress, almost always like in the same direction. So this here is our humerus, so our upper arm bone here. And usually, like, the humerus is getting stress from the same direction for the most part. This is the weight-bearing part of the bone. And so it has to be densely packed with bony tissue, that really strong, rigid tissue. And so the compact bone is made up of what are called osteons, and osteons are like tree trunks, and they're all compacted in this big forest of the compact bone. Each of these tree trunks is called an osteon, also called a haversian system, right? We always name things multiple times, but these are osteons, the cylinders themselves. And just like a tree in a forest, the trees have layers, they have tree rings within them. And so each tree ring is called a lamella, right? So ignore the E if you want to say singular, lamellae, add the E if you want to say plural. So each one of these layers here is a lamella. Right? So compact bone is structurally comprised of osteons, which are made of lamellae. So each osteon, again, contains several lamellae, so 4 to 20 of them arranged in concentric rings. This particular arrangement is very resistant to stress, because we have collagen fibers running in opposite directions. So here we can see some collagen running this way, here collagen running that way and that way. And so what this does is it provides a little bit of resistance and resiliency, really, to a little bit of twisting. Right? Like, especially if you play sports or something, like you're stopping and starting all the time. And so you need a little bit of twisting without shattering your bones. Inside the lamellae, we have this canal. So think of like a straw, like inside the straw. is like a canal, an open space. This canal is lined with endosteum, so it has those osteogenic stem cells in them. They can be turned on to be bone building cells or bone breaking down cells. And this is where our blood vessels are. Right? So here we have an artery, a vein, and a nerve. These colors are the same all the time. So red artery, blue vein, and yellow nerve. If we zoom in to an osteon itself, we see that those lamellae aren't solid, they're not smooth. In fact, those lamellae have kind of little holes um, within them. And so inside those holes are cells called osteocytes. Again, osteo means bone, cyte means cell or like mature cell. And so osteocytes are the living component of the bone. They essentially get trapped during the process of building the bone, and they live there for the rest of their lives, nourishing the bone and maintaining homeostasis within them. Okay. The little holes that they're in are called a lacuna for singular, add an E for plural. So again, a cavity that's surrounded by the bone. Um, of course, in order for this cell way over here to get oxygen, to get nutrients from this blood vessel over here, it can't just like crawl over there. Oxygen and nutrients can't diffuse through this bony tissue. And so what has to happen is that these resources need to diffuse from one cell to the next to the next. And so the cells are actually connected via little canals. They like stick their little cytoplasm, little arms out, and they're kind of touching each other through these canals. So the little canals themselves are called canaliculi, just the narrow passageways, allowing the different osteocytes to send stuff back and forth. So this is just another way of showing this, kind of summarizing everything that we just discussed. So on the outside of the bone here, we have the periosteum. All right, it has the fibrous part on the outside, osteogenic stem cells on the inside. We have blood vessels which pass through the periosteum and into the bone. Sorry. The blood vessels are going to branch, sending branches up through the central canal of each osteon, which is made up of these concentric lamellae, and there are little osteocytes kind of embedded in lacunae in between the lamellae. I like this image up here because it actually shows the little osteocytes reaching out and kind of holding hands with their neighboring cells through those canaliculi. So the osteons aren't the only structural component of the compact bone. We also have concentric lamellae that go all the way around the bone. So this is like building the diameter of the bone bigger and bigger and bigger. We can lay down a layer and a layer and a layer, kind of like tree rings, literally. So these are just inside the periosteum, these circumferential lamellae, and the more circumferential lamellae that we lay down, right, layer after layer after layer, actually adds diameter to the bone, and the bigger the bone is, the stronger the bone is. And so if you are, like the last video showed, like if you are starting a new training regimen, you are building up more and more strength, or you get a job that is, pretty physically demanding, you can actually change your bones, change and thicken the diameter of your bones so they can be stronger for whatever you choose to do with your life. I also want to point out these perforating canals. These blood vessels, again, enter from the outside, branch off into the central canals of the osteons, but this blood vessel here, right, the one that is traveling in a transverse direction, we call these perforating canals because they're literally like poking a hole in the bone and delivering blood to each osteon. So that's the compact bone. Let's think about the spongy bone now. Again, structure matches function. You should always think about how does this structure make sense in this place and give rise to the functions of this tissue, of this organ. And so the spongy bone is usually not weight-bearing. It's kind of protected by the outer shell that is the weight-bearing part. And so you might think that, oh, it's really weak, but in fact, it's not weak at all. It's structured differently, but still very strong. It looks like it's poorly organized, like there's little bits of bone going in all sorts of different directions, but actually, the spongy bone is very organized to align itself along lines of stress. right? So if you are a dancer and you're always kind of doing like certain movements like uh, these trabeculae, the little riblets of bone, are going to align along whatever position you're usually putting your body in. And so again, uh, this structure, right? It looks really porous. It looks like it's kind of weak. The fact that it says spongy bone makes you think like, oh, it's kind of squishy, but it's not squishy. Um, in fact, the fact that it's kind of spread out in this way is very similar to the trusses in a building. So if you think of the main academic spine, if you look up like by the library or in C and D wing or whatever, you see trusses, right? These um, iron iron scaffolding here. We can see that this isn't like one solid piece of iron, right? So it's not solid like compact bone is solid, but instead it has a lot of spaces in between um, little bits of angle iron. And so the way that this is designed, the reason why the roof in the academic spine doesn't just fall right down, is because these bits of angle iron are arranged in such a way that they kind of distribute the weight. Um, and so they're just as strong as a solid piece of iron, but it's a lot lighter than a solid piece of iron. And so our bones do exactly the same thing. Our spongy bone has these little riblets, these little trabeculae that are arranged in exactly the right way to distribute the weight based on whatever you do with your body. And at the same time, it's lightening our skeleton. Like, can you imagine walking around with like, you know, 50 pounds of bone, right? It would take a lot more energy to move our bodies. And so we lighten the load a little bit with our spongy bone. Again, uh, this lattice essentially aligns along stress lines, distributing the weight and supporting whatever we're doing with our body. Also, the fact that there's now this space in between, we can use that for storage. And so, like I mentioned before, the spongy bone houses our red bone marrow. So let's zoom into spongy bone a little bit more. Here we can see spongy bone in an epiphysis. Each one of these little riblets of bone or struts of bone is called a trabecula for singular, trabeculae for plural. It is all covered with endosteum. So again, we always have those little um, osteogenic stem cells in our spongy bone as well. These trabeculae are not arranged into osteons, so they're not like cylinders, but they do have lamellae, right? So if we take a cross section through one of them, we can see a lamella, 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 but there's not a central canal. It's not a cylinder. They are arranged differently. So no central canal, no perforating canals, but keep in mind that these are still very vascular because all of this space in between is chock full of red bone marrow and blood vessels. Okay. So to conclude, we have just looked at long bones, um, the structures, right? Epiphyses versus diaphyses. We've looked at some of the structures and we've even zoomed in to look at them microscopically. I do want to point out that we do have spongy bone in our flat bones, in our regular bones, in all of the bones of our body. And so we do have bone marrow in all of those places as well. And so you might have heard of bone marrow transplants, right? Or needing to test bone marrow. And so how exactly do we get that bone marrow out of the spongy bone? Well, a physician literally drills through the compact bone, inserts a needle, and extracts bone marrow. For the most part, in adults, bone marrow is taken from our hips, right? So from our iliac crest, which we'll learn about in the next unit. And the reason we take it from here as opposed to other bones, for example, our sternum or something, is that it's much safer here. If there is some kind of an accident where, you know, the drill goes in the wrong direction or the needle goes in the wrong place, there's not much around here that's going to get damaged fatally. So your heart's not here, your lungs aren't here, you're not going to puncture a lung with some kind of a mistake. And so generally, bone marrow is extracted from the hips. All right, so thanks guys for listening. Stay tuned for the next video.